when we do a land acknowledgement, honoring all the ways that we're showing up here today. And with that, we're also honoring the land and the places that we're showing up from. So I just want to begin there. I am speaking to you today from Boston on the traditional lands of the Massachusetts tribe. I'm speaking as a Black woman, descendant of slaves who were stolen from their land to come and work the soil of this land that for centuries before them was stewarded, cultivated, and loved by Native people. When Indigenous communities in the US gather, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land they're meeting on. And I'm here today to honor those ancestors, my ancestors and the lands that connect us all in these spaces across the country we now occupy. Honoring the land means honoring everything we are a part of. It acknowledges our inseparable connectedness with everything else in the world. It acknowledges that all we do has an effect on everything else. So in honor of all the directions, we honor the land, the water, the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars. We honor the ancestors that came before us and those that share the space with us. We honor everything that now lives with respect within this space. So I ask us to remember that wherever you are in the Americas, you are in Native space, and that there are Indigenous people that belong to that place. May all we do in Native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for those to come. Thank you. So just to kind of kick us off, I want to start with our healing journey. Why even we started to think about what does healing-centered community development mean? And I personally have an interesting path to community development that not everyone knows. I went to the United States Military Academy undergrad, which is an Army military academy. And then I was active duty in the Army for 6 years. I'm still in the Massachusetts National Guard, where I do sexual assault response coordination and victim advocacy. And you can imagine that those career paths have been stressful at certain times, particularly in deployed environments or other high stress environments. However, what I found is that my public health and community-based work has also been equally challenging. And in part because the challenges that I've been seeking to overcome in those spaces, the communities I'm working in, the people I'm serving, the questions I'm asking are my own. The hardships, the trauma are my own. However, I'm part of organizations that are being led by folks who are not from my community. And so often I'm representing something that is not my own with community members that are. And so what we're hearing and experiencing has been really consistent with research that we've been lifting up for some time now in our profession, that within the fields of community development, Black and Indigenous professionals have the particularly challenging task of identifying, addressing, and then healing their own trauma within one's personal life, be it generationally inherited or direct, reconciling any secondary trauma exposure potentially experienced by working in oppressed communities, particularly within their own affinity group, professionally navigating organizational systems and work cultures entrenched with white supremacist delusions. And as a result, Black and Indigenous practitioners are vulnerable to trauma while working to protect Black Indigenous people also vulnerable to traumas within systems of perpetual racial trauma. And this trauma has existed for years and is inherited by generation after generation. And so last year really exemplified this even more by illuminating a host of stressors that many of us have been working to address for decades, especially organizations and practitioners in our cohorts, right? Economic wealth gaps, healthcare inequities, housing insecurity, white supremacy and racial violence. So 2020 and even early now in 2021 or mid now in 2021 have brought to the surface all of the many cracks in the system. We see how delicate our sense of security is, how vital our social connections are, and the limits of our mental and emotional capacities. It is important to acknowledge out loud that in an effort to support our most vulnerable communities, frontline practitioners and organizations are being crushed in the strain. right? We are impacted, especially Black and Indigenous individuals, especially women. In our community of practice tables, we've informally observed over the last year signs of increased direct and secondary trauma, manifested such in hypervigilance, avoidance, and lack of focus, increased workloads and fatigue, articulations of internalized shame and anti-Blackness, and physical ailments such as headaches, heart palpitations, digestive issues, insomnia. More broadly, we know this hurt is felt for many throughout this country, regardless of profession. The implications of ongoing pandemics, new and historic, such as COVID-19 and systemic racism, make a clear case for national reckoning and healing. Y'all, we are hopeful because we believe America is on a journey to healing, however disruptive it may be. However, it is imperative for our organizations and institutions to step fully into that journey, having perpetuated much of the trauma and inequities we see and experience. And despite what leaders may publicly express, our white supremacist systems only know how to protect and promote business as usual. So without explicit interventions that center healing, liberation, anti-racism, and the mitigation of cumulative trauma, our field will be ineffective and unsustainable. So we created the Healing-Centered Community Development Framework outlined in the paper that we hope you can all read if you haven't already, called Building to Heal, by recognizing that if these traumas can be passed down through generations, then we believe so can collective healing. And this is our offering to start. And so here's a little bit about how we're defining that. And so you've learned quite a bit about trauma-informed care, or a framework for that with the STAR trauma training, which is amazing. And so we'll talk a little bit about grounding ourselves there. Trauma is the body's response to distressing events that makes it difficult for a person to cope. And so often we think about acute trauma, an isolated event that happens to an individual like an assault. But what we know, and if you've taken the training, what you know now is that trauma is much more intersectional. It can be acute or continuous or cumulative. It can be individual and secondary or vicarious, which is exposure to someone else's trauma, like witnessing or hearing it. And so chattel slavery, Jim Crow, anti-Black terrorism, lynchings, witnessing murders of unarmed Black people by police, dignity violations are all violent, traumatic experiences, and they're collective, structural, historical, and intergenerational forms of trauma. Racism is one of the most pervasive and powerful forms of trauma in this country, and everyone is harmed by it. And research shows that 90% of people experience a traumatic event in their lifetime, and more experience more than one. So the trauma-informed practice came from the medical field, but it's a shift in practice that normalizes our trauma experiences and assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma, and recognizes that presence of trauma symptoms. It acknowledges the role of trauma and what it might play in an individual's life, and meets it with a better prioritization of people's full humanity and lived experiences, and prioritizes choice and transparency. However, it can be limited to the symptoms of trauma versus the opposite, or the opportunities of those experiences and what those experiences can provide. So healing is the body's natural response of restoring health. So if trauma disrupts our health, healing can help restore it. And if we understand that trauma is intersectional as well, then we also understand that healing is individual, collective, spiritual, cultural, and intergenerational. So healing-centered engagement or practice, which was coined by Dr. Sean Ginwright, recognizes that we aren't harmed in a vacuum, and thus we aren't healed in one either. And to heal from collective traumas, we must take collective approaches. Trauma-informed hones in on the trauma, and people can become defined by those experiences. But healing defines by the assets that can be leveraged from the person's full lived experiences and focuses on the possibilities. What can be done? What does liberation truly look like? How can I imagine a future that I want to see versus one that's feasible. The possibilities that we often limit by what's feasible versus what we can imagine. So with that, supporters of this work must not only be anti-racist, which is taking an active effort to work against racism's multidimensional aspects, but also pro-liberation, which actively reaches toward liberty and justice for all. And that takes imagination, because we've only dreamed of what this could look like. We've not actually ever experienced it. So here's how we conceptualize it. We had to first tap into our own radical imaginations. What could a workspace look like that radically welcomed us? What would it feel like? And what wouldn't be there? What wouldn't we have to worry about? We recognize that asking others to decolonize their workspaces first required us to unpack our own habits, practices, norms that we wanted to lay down and unburden ourselves of in a space that really allowed us to thrive. So we created a space where we could live into our expertise and hold the conditions for actualizing our learning. And by centering our experience and other Black and Indigenous peoples, this is how we conceptualize what we needed in a safe space, with hopes that as we hear from and center more thoughts, the framework will continually grow. So quickly, this framework pushes us to shift our practice, guided by our work in community. The framework offers principles, strategies, and tools that support individual acknowledgement of racialized power dynamics and positionality in communities. It fosters trust building and collaboration, and it makes space for the restoration necessary to spur radical imagination in us all. In order to imagine something we've never seen in this country, racial equality, requires a creativity we have yet to fully unlock. And so Chandra's going to talk a little bit more about the framework itself.
Thank you, Megan. And so as Megan shared, the Healing-Centered Community Development Framework is a strength-based approach, and it advances a holistic view of healing, as she shared, which recenters culture and identity as a central feature in well-being. And so these principles articulate the norms and expectations around how an organization, group, and its community members will operate into the future, and provides guidance on how everyone within it can contribute through the decisions that they make and the actions that they take. So we protect holistic well-being as a universal right that everyone deserves. We value cultural assets and lift them up and amplify them as part of how we understand resilience. We do our work by prioritizing process and facilitating trust building and centering Blackness and indigeneity in how we work. We measure our work by better relationship, to be in better relationship with ourselves, the land, and the communities as outcomes. And we always reach toward an end goal of a more healed and liberated future. Our strategies take us deeper into how we apply the healing-centered principles. These are the choices that we make. We begin with reflecting as an opportunity to build self-awareness and acknowledge injustice in history. We involve community by lifting up and amplifying inherent strengths and assets. We restore and create intentional spaces for healing and being able to come together and gather around this. We invest by recognizing the power that already exists within community and how we're also building other traditional forms of power. We also require creativity and how we're reimagining to advance liberation and being able to get rid of the things that no longer serve us and replace them with the things that do. Through this work, we seek to build a culture of evaluation and to provide a process that embeds continuous reflection of self, project, and the well-being of our communities. As a part of this effort, we seek to transform the power dynamics that shape the community development field by centering healing and how we evaluate our work. We have made our commitment to healing and liberation clear from the beginning of the evaluation process so that we can always begin with the end in mind. And as opposed to a logic model, we created an experiential model to demonstrate how this work feels in our bodies and how we experience it. And so we expanded our definition of healing to include ourselves and tested out healing-centered processes with our internal team, and was able to gather and compile those discoveries from those processes to create the model that you see here. And so beginning with going back to our principles and framing this around how we are more centering and protecting well-being and the ability to unburden as we enter space together and build more confidence. We are looking to value assets by aligning our decisions with priorities and creating a sense of familiarity and comfort in the spaces that we facilitate. We're prioritizing trust building and addressing repair that needs to happen between relationships to create more trust and connection. And we're always measuring this work by a deeper understanding of our own journey and the ways that we're interdependent in this journey to repair harm. And again, how we're creating both processes internally and external for what this work looks like, and how, in my experience in this team, have always been able to assert myself in my fullness, and how it's been more than just having me as a colleague instead of always having to prove that I deserve to be here, and thinking about what authenticity looks like and how I can trust a space that can hold all of me. Next, wanted to walk through how we're understanding our impact. And so this diagram is from the book Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit by Mary Frances Winter. And this diagram illustrates how we enter communities at the level of the roots of systemic racism and work with practitioners so that the institutions that they're a part of can bear different fruits in community. This is also how we exit communities. We focus on practitioners, preparing them to work with residents, because we recognize that we won't be here tomorrow, but organizations will, and that problems exist in systems, and the organizations that uphold and perpetuate systemic inequities, and that the problem doesn't exist within residents. So how are we framing our targets of change? We begin by identifying harm, who is creating it and why, and preparing practitioners within organizations to do the work needed to first stop the harm and recognize their own positionality within this. Once the organization has changed, they can change the relationship that they have with communities and work in a way that's rooted in healing so that those impacts can be realized. And so ultimately, we want to sow the seeds to get organizations to a different place and change the enabling conditions so that they can work with communities differently. We see our work in these three buckets around building, bolstering, and shifting. And we found that it takes bolstering our individual and team capacity to try out different practices and integrate them into our systems. We found that shifting organizational culture to promote and protect and prioritizing healing-centered processes as part of the work. And lastly, by building a national network to collaborate and learn from another so that we can begin to do this work together instead of silos. And it's this comprehensive approach that allows us to create the collective impact in our work. I'll now pass it over to Nella to talk more about some of the tools that are part of our inventory.
Thanks, Chandra. So when we share all of these ideas that we've been speaking about for the last 20 minutes, often people are really eager to know, what does this look like in practice? How can I do this? And we always hear this craving for a concrete, tangible set of tools, tangible steps people can take, and for getting really specific about what it looks like. And we've responded to that demand. We've worked with several practitioners and cohorts and working groups to get specific, apply these principles and these concepts. And we were even able to create a criterion for our Green Communities 2020 update. And you can see that we can paste it in the chat and send it in the follow-up materials as well. But criterion 1.7 is our cultural resilience criterion, which was really co-created by a number of practitioners, thinking about how do you embed this in a process for creating a building. So at the same time that I want to provide, and we all want to provide this kind of tactical guidance for people who want it broken down, it's really important also, I think, to recognize a few things. First, that, you know, I have mixed feelings about presenting quote unquote tools and creating an implication that there is something that can be fixed and you can move on, or that there is a perfect tool, and if you get that tool, then you'll be able to have the solution. And so the tools we provide are really grounded in this kind of approach of, like, we use the word practices a lot, things you can rehearse again and again, just like building a muscle, or, you know, doing exercises where you're building strength, flexibility, and endurance over time. We really are thinking about how do you build practices for things that we all need to keep getting better at, like tuning into your body, as Megan mentioned, or showing up with curiosity, and cultivating creativity and imagination. And another thing I want to say is that, you know, my personal how-to guide is going to be different from yours. And there is no one single toolkit that is going to make this easy. We're asking ourselves and everyone that we are sharing this with to think about this as transformational change in our systems and the ways we work. Recognizing that racism is foundational in our society means that my default ways of working and the practices and tools that we learned are often reinforcing racist systems. And I am a white woman who has figured out how to navigate success in white dominant systems. So I wish I could say I always notice this, but I have to work really hard to notice, and then I have to work really hard and try things that are outside of my comfort zone in order to begin to operate differently. So being part of this team has been one of the most important tools, if you want to call it that, but the relationships I have with my in particular have been really essential to my ability to continually see with fresh eyes and interrogate the assumptions that I am bringing to the table. And I have so many opportunities to learn and build my own muscles for changing the racist habits that I carry. So I often reflect at the end of the day on a moment where I'm defaulting to some sort of habit that is causing harm. And a colleague will draw my attention to it, or someone else will draw my attention to it. And this has really impacted, begin to see, remind others, and also to shift the things that I am doing. So all to say, it's really important to work differently in order for the systems we're part of to be different. And what that means for a person who is white is going to be really different for a person who is BIPOC. So all of that said, we'll share some of the useful guidance that we have been able to generate and that can help you or those you work with to think through these principles and strategies, and how to unpack them, especially in the context of a project you may be working on in a specific place. So in addition to relationships, I think one of the most important tools that I continually am reminded of is showing up with a question. Rather than having a rule book or a formula, showing up with a good question is really essential. And so we organized our healing-centered project screen, which you can find in the framework document at the end. And we organized it with overarching questions. So this was co-authored with a working group of partners, including developers, artists, cultural organizers working across the country, from rural and Native American communities to small towns and large cities. So within these questions are then a series of prompts and questions that align with the core principles of the framework that Chandra shared earlier. And this is intended to help live up to the goal of centering culture and healing in the project. Again, remembering that this is a fundamental driver of resilience and well-being. Culture and healing are really fundamental to resilience and well-being. So the prompts take you more deeply into the kinds of design decisions and process decisions that you have an opportunity to make. So I'm going to walk through this pretty quickly with just to act as an illustration that I'm hoping you can see sort of how we go through a series of questions nested within questions. So this first overarching question, then you go deeper and ask about narrative, about process, and about space. And in the second question, paying attention to assets, thinking about building connections and ways to increase social cohesion. And then again, under the third question, a series of prompts to consider how can you support resident leadership, optimize for multiple positive impacts, and make co-creation the way the work is accomplished. So the suite of nested questions is a great tool because you can a lot of contexts, and from it emerge a number of practices you can employ. So some of the practices that we highlight in the paper were also built out of this foundation, and there are templates for and guides for using them also in the Green Communities Criterion, and I'll add some of those links after I'm done speaking. But one of the tools is a cultural assets guide. So, and another is convening a community advisory group. And so for these practices, again, they work with some of the core questions presented in the healing-centered screen, but then they go even another level deeper and provide a number of prescriptive sets of guidance if you want it for assessing local cultural assets and for convening a cultural advisory group, so that the toolkits that we've provided under Green Communities have a couple pages of prompts and lists to kind of get you thinking about what sort of cultural sets may be in this, for example. So I share all of this just to provide an entry point. These tools give guidance on how to integrate community and resident participation. Probably many of you, I know many of you are actually already doing this in ways that are really inspiring, and others may feel like there are something that you could learn from reading these documents. So they're not the only way, but they're just helping to unlock people's imagination if you feel like you want to understand how to go about this. And the intention is to really honor cultural identities, resident voices, and community histories, so that the built environment and the processes and programs that we are designing are providing not only health, but healing. So just to offer in the end a little list of some of the tools that we're providing, we offer workshops and can go deeper with people who are interested, and really are grateful for so many of the Spark partners here who have been part of the community of practice that has helped to inform this framework and to see what it looks like in the work that you do in the communities you serve every day. So we have walked through this big picture and some of the granular tools. I feel like, deep breath, this is a lot to take in. So I'm gonna have Megan offer us a moment of transition to let it settle for a moment before we shift into.
Thank you, Nella. So we've really reached the end of our offering. And this is an abridged version of a presentation that we've done before. So you can also check out the longer version of our webinar if you are interested with all the questions that were asked there. We also really invite you to read the paper because there's a lot of information there to really understand more deeply the thought, the research, the engagement that went into informing this. But we know this is a lot of information. So we're just going to take a moment to have a collective breath. And if you know me, you know that I always like to have a moment of breath and a moment within our bodies. So wherever you are, just find a comfortable seat or position with your body. You could even lie down if you want, or if you're standing, and just allow your feet to find the floor, to feel grounded there. It might be soothing to close your eyes or shift your gaze downward and just inhale in through your nose and out through your mouth with maybe an audible sigh. And take notice of how you feel. What sensations are coming up in your body? What can you be aware of that is present? Not changing anything, just noticing. Maybe just following your breath, wherever it's easy to follow, in the chest or the stomach or the nostrils. And maybe think about what items or concepts stood out to you. What gave you comfort or discomfort? What will you carry forward? Just connecting with your breath and allowing whatever thoughts that arise to be there. Offering them kindness without judgment. And maybe taking one more deep inhale and releasing everything out. Softly opening your eyes. And if it feels good, maybe take a moment to share in the chat what's coming up for you now, if anything. Thoughts or questions, comments, concerns. Thinking about rest, restorative action in a productivity-based field. Yes. Olivia, hi. Gratitude for these resources. Thank you for sharing. And if there are any questions for our team, please let us know. Any questions or thoughts? Ella, I don't know if you have any questions that came in or that were sent in, but thank you for listening to our presentation.
Megan, one of the questions that came up, and it was submitted before, so it might actually shift, is how does this change how folks can show up in and with communities of color?
How does it change how folks can show up? I think it can change a lot depending on how you're already showing up. And so I think, you know, our first strategy, and one in which we're building out resources right now that we've been working with folks on, is to reflect. And oftentimes that's not what we're told to do before we begin any particular project. But we thought it was really important that we first reflect, right? Checking in with yourself, where you are, what your capacity is for the work, what your positionality is to this work, right? So as Nella mentioned, right, my positionality to the work, given whatever community I'm working within, is going to be very different from hers. And so how does that change the way I'm going to enter with a question and what that question might look like? And so I think it's asking us to take a step back before taking a step forward into the work, to really understand who we are and how we show up before we actually show up, and providing some resources to do that. I don't know, Nella or Chandra, if you have anything to add about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that point around positionality. I think it's also about reorienting what the goal is. Like, the goal is not so that Meghan and Nella can enter community in the same way. I think it's to recognize what strengths they bring, and like to be able to craft strategies accordingly, and think about the additional time needed for trust building in communities where Nella identifies but Meghan doesn't, or vice versa. And so we really also see this work as shifting what our collective goals are and our collective work, and then what our individual work is.
Yeah, I really love that, Chandra, because I think that also, right, when we think about healing and the experiences that have been traumatic for you in this field, right, I'm sure everyone can reflect on a presentation, a workshop, a conversation that you didn't feel prepared for, or that you weren't comfortable with, that you had to just do anyway because it was part of the expectation of what you thought your job was. And so it also is about, like, right, recognizing how the ways in which we're asked to show up sometimes are harmful, and allowing us to, harmful to us as well as the other person or other people who we're engaging with, and saying to us, like, let me rethink what I even have to be doing, right? What is my asset and strength in this situation? And every single thing does not have to be that, right? I don't have to be an expert generalist in everything, that I can have strengths and assets and ask other people to show up in other ways that I can't. And so really trying to think through what that looks like collectively.
Meghan, I think that's actually a great transition to the next question. There was just a question about, as you guys are kind of trying to like live out the work that you all have collected here and put together, where are the places that sometimes feel harder, or are, you know, barriers that you all experience, and from your different kind of positionalities? Some good tough questions in there.
Well, I will say, I mean, I said it a little bit in the opening about tools. You know, one thing is just our relationship to some of the demands and expectations, especially culturally in the community development sector. And I think someone reflected on it in the chat as well, about these spaces of productivity being a really hard context in which to be actually not even centering, but advocating for even the smallest amount of restoration, whether it be in slowing down the pace at which something has to happen, or whether it be acknowledging that, like, when you are gathering with people, it's about more than just getting through an agenda. It's about recognizing each other's full humanity. Another thing I think is really difficult is Meghan mentioned feasibility, like this sort of focus on feasibility. Is it feasible often gets in the way of imagining things that are probably not immediately feasible, but that we do want to see. And so that ability to kind of imagination, creativity, and not be tied to feasibility is really important, because a lot of things actually are possible if you give them a longer timeline or a few more resources. There's a lot of ways to actually create some feasibility if there's something enough people are really on board for. And similarly, you know, the demand for like case studies and sort of proving is also something. It's like we don't necessarily, there are a lot of stories, and there are also some things that, you know, we still have yet to learn, but always having to make the case or prove kind of gets in the way sometimes of trying and failing and being allowed to learn along the way, and have some of those lessons be a bit messy. And so this expectation that things will be like tidily wrapped up in a bow really quickly gets in the way of really being able to learn together in these complicated, and as Miriam Kaba says, fumbling ways. And finally, I will say, like, just for me, the barriers, I bring a lot of barriers because I have, and I'm sure a lot of other people do, but like, you know, I was thinking about an activity we're preparing for another workshop, and how I'm like, I was thinking about a way to debrief it, and Meghan was like, well, that's just really centering. She didn't say it so explicitly, she said it very gently, but basically she helped me see that the way I was going to just completely center people who experience many layers of privilege and give them a chance to understand, oh, what do other people who experience a more marginalized identities, what is their experience like, and get a chance to learn from them. But Meghan was like, you know, how can those people who spend so much time burdened by this marginalized identity and what it means to navigate with that, how can this be a healing debrief for them? And it doesn't matter if the person who experiences white privilege and is sort of oblivious to these other challenges gets something out of it, as much as it matters that we center the person who is continually marginalized. And this is why the toolkit for me is really different for the toolkit. You know, I need to kind of go to the mat for some things and really work hard. I feel like, you know, some of my colleagues of color need to take a break, and that's what they need to be invested in. And so a long answer, but I feel like there's a lot in there. Thank you.
I think there's a lot that's hard about this work and this framework. I'm just looking at Marissa's question or comment in the chat saying that I feel a lot of comfort with this approach, and I love the phrase, how do outcomes feel, but I'm nervous to implement them in spaces that are not yet designed for healing. And I think the reality is that most places aren't designed for healing, right? Like most of this work, unfortunately, is kind of at the cusp of trying to think about this. Is emergent, really. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've been thinking a lot about how do we get it into criterias like green communities criteria that's in 32 qualified allocation plans for people creating new developments across the country, 32 states qualified allocation plans. And how are we as enterprise making these types of tools available to folks so that also you don't feel like you're alone in this, right? Like you don't have to be the person that's, let's bring this healing centered framework to our organization, but actually here's a really large nonprofit that's doing this work, that it's one of the ways in which they do this work, and asking us, hey, can you be a part of my team, my squad, my cohort of folks that are really talking about how we bring this work into our organizations more fully. But I think that that is one of the big challenges, particularly in big bureaucracies that have kind of figured out the way in which they do a particular thing, is how do we start to make that change and advocate for that change? But the reality is, these are the conversations that we're having every single time we talk to a community-based organization, every single time we talk to a CDC. So this work and the need for this work is out there. So many folks are asking for a different way of doing things. And so the demand is there. And really, if we're able to offer the approach in a way that feels good for people, that we can articulate it in a way that makes sense, I think folks will be more open to it because they know that what they're doing isn't working. Even if they're pushing back against it, you know, they know. And so I think that's what we're really trying to do in this work, in the way that we're trying to lead it. Nella and Chandra, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect that comment to Whitney's comment around the sense of urgency and what I call this performance of engagement that is actually just outreach, where government entities tell communities what they're going to do and ask for their input to make it appear as though it's engagement with intentionality. And so I think a lot of our even assessments of this work and when we enter partnerships comes with some type of power analysis to identify where that urgency is coming from and like to make that our target of change versus those who are being disproportionately burdened by that urgency or that performance of engagement or impending development projects. And so we often map out who the stakeholders are and what are their incentives to be involved in this work and where those pressures come from, so that we can start the conversation there versus the community benefit that they're kind of putting in front to show their intentions versus what the actual motivations are of it. So I think even having a reframe of which projects you say yes to, which opportunities you get involved in, wanting to always start with where that sense of urgency is, because it's often fabricated for something that has nothing to do with what is being presented. And that's a practice that I feel like we are modeling and also want to encourage groups to think about as well.
I think I would also just add, I am the arts and culture lead for Spark. And so I am at our Spark national team, and this is a framework for which I am uplifting. And so as Spark partners, if you're trying to figure out, like as a more explicit way, if you're trying to figure out how to insert this, this framework into things that you're doing, I'm happy for us to have conversations about that. For us to think of, we've had several conversations with local planning departments across the country who are also trying to figure out how they change their practices and how could they actually implement thinking about work like this in their local departments and across their different local, authorities. So I think, you know, that's a more discreet way too for us to just know that you have access to be able to talk with us, for us to be able to think about this. And what we've seen is really the collective advancement of the framework really works. Like when you have a table of folks who are interested in thinking about how this can be applied, there's much more power there in multiple people wanting to bring this into the community and use this as a way to think about new approaches. So would be happy to talk about that more too.
We have just a few more minutes remaining. Whitney, I know you had asked a question and it might have been answered a little bit, but if you want to share a little bit more or ask any clarification, so please feel free. We can wait another minute or two, but I want to give us also some time to close out. So if there are any more questions, just please feel free to unmute. So we have one question from Chandra saying, this has been invaluable. How do you get yourself back on track when you fall out of your rhythm? Great question.
I think for me, I have to remind myself who I belong to and also who I'm accountable to. I think this work, everything can feel urgent. Everything can feel like a priority. But if I don't keep at my core where my accountability lies and how, in the ways I've already been paid for and deserving of the opportunity to do this work, that's when I get distracted. So I think for me, going back to that place of accountability is how I stay undistracted.
Yeah, and I would add, who's in your accountability circle too, like who are those, and being able to identify who the people are that can hold you accountable, but also with healing, like hold you accountable with love. Because I think this group of people for me, just as Nella said, I was like, oh, I didn't need to check her when I said whatever I said, but it's great to hear that when I said that, it resonated for her. But I feel like this is a group of folks who we can hold each other accountable and be like, actually, like maybe let's rethink that, or like what you're saying, actually maybe that's not your burden to carry, or actually, Brandon isn't here right now because he needed to take some time to catch his flight, as opposed to trying to stick in more things to do before he went off. And our community being able to say, you know what, that's perfectly fine, and you need to be able to do what you do for you, and it's important to prioritize yourself. And so when you're falling off track, to have those folks who you can go to, who will be like, hey, well, what do you want to hold yourself accountable to? And also, we're not mad at you, sis, when you when you fall off. We still love you, and like, let us know how we support you. I think that that's incredibly important, particularly for people who are experiencing so much pressure in so many places and so many directions all the time. So I'm happy to be in your accountability circle, Chandra, if you need more support.
Okay, I think we have 1 minute left, and Nella shared a survey that folks would be great if they could complete, but we'll also share in a follow-up email. I think I'll just pass to Meghan now.
Well, thank you. And we're so excited that y'all could join and just hear a little bit about our framework. As I mentioned, this is in development. As we continue to talk to people, our resources continue to grow, but also myself, Chandra, Brandon are part of your Spark team and Spark network. And so we've already had some conversations with different tools with folks in Atlanta and other places. And so if you're interested in going deeper and thinking more about this and how it lands at your table or with your arts and culture lead champions, please let me know. And we look forward to just continuing to grow and work with all of you. Thank you again for your time.
And a huge thank you to Meghan, Nella, Chandra, and Brandon as well, just for this amazing presentation and all the work that y'all have put together.
Allegedly.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Please tell a friend if you got something out of this.
Because that's not how it's our position, because we have to be able to identify what staff at different levels don't